Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Adult Education Forum. And welcome to folks who are joining us online in the live stream or are watching a video at a later time. We can see you through the camera. Good to have you here. It's an exciting day today. We've got 3 different books to go through. So next week will be much slower paced, but this week, 3 different books, which I think is exciting. Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Maybe not the most read books in the Older Testament, but 3 really important books for reasons we'll talk about and for reasons we won't even have time to talk about. But before getting into those, I want to have a couple of announcements. One is just, as always, we have a video with an Old Testament scholar. This is Brennan Breed, who teaches at Columbia Theological Seminary, a Presbyterian seminary in Decatur, Georgia. I know I have a tendency to talk quickly sometimes. He outdoes me if you've watched this video. You have to listen to it twice or slow it down or something. At least he knows he does. That's partly trying to do 3 books in a half hour. But it's a great video. Also, if you want to discuss these books further, I'll be in the Meisel room on Wednesday evening, and that will also be on Zoom. The link is in the Monday afternoon e-blast that comes out from Westminster. If you don't know what that means, see me and we'll get you set up with that. But we'll be doing that, which is always going to be fun. And then I'm happy to announce this summer we're going to be doing an abbreviated series, dates still to be determined, called Between the Testaments, which I'm going to lead, probably 3 or 4 Sundays, where we're going to talk about those other books that people sometimes ask about, that Protestants sometimes call the Apocrypha. Roman Catholics call them the deuterocanonical books. There's also some non-biblical literature that takes place in Judaism between the time the Older Testament writings are being written down and the coming of Jesus. Judaism changes, Judaism develops, Judaism adjusts, like any religion changes over time during those centuries. And so it's a chance to do, maybe some more esoteric books that are out there, but also to get a sense of what Judaism looks like when Jesus shows up on the scene. What are people talking about? What are people hoping for? What are people disagreeing about? So stay tuned for that. I'm excited for it coming up this summer. But now you get to talk. I want to start off with some discussion questions at tables, and they're maybe a little bit broad. What is theology? And what is it good for? 2 different questions. I'm just curious about what this could mean. And if you're thinking like theology, how do we learn about God? Where do we learn about God? You might break that question down that way. So I'm going to give you about 5 minutes at your tables to just talk about this. These aren't questions that have one right answer. This is for you, right? What is theology for you? What is talking about God for you? And what is it good for? What is it helpful? And if you're online, feel free to use the chat. Toss answers back and forth. That would be a chance for you to engage the question. I'll come back in 5 minutes. All right. They're intimidating questions, aren't they? Not at all. At the seminary where I work, we give a degree called a Master of Theology. How's that for arrogance? I don't have that degree. Maybe I can explore that one. But the question of, where or how do we learn about God sounds complicated, but it's an important one. And hopefully one of the things that came up at the tables is we don't maybe all think about that in the exact same way, right? The sources of our theology. Where and how do we learn from God? Theology has historically been dominated. Kind of formal theology has been dominated by people who are literate, by men, by people who think in particular ways. You think about the Protestant Reformation, to basically skip over 1,500 years, but the Protestant Reformation as well, with our focus on the Word of God and our focus on Word and in the Presbyterian tradition, a distrust of images and art. We've got a particular didactic way of understanding theology that's really in the mainstream, but most people think about God in a variety of ways. So Beth has a microphone. Just quick answers. What are some of the things that came up at your table in terms of, especially the first question, what is theology? Anybody want to share things that came at your table? They can be things like the Bible. They can be things like Sunday morning at 9:30. Yeah, the microphone's right behind you on your left shoulder there. Oh. Sorry, a little tech issue here. We got it.
Excuse me. I say theology is the study of religion, its practice, but doesn't necessarily mean Christian religion.
Which one? Who is the theos, the God that we're
That's
talking
right.
about behind this?
We think of it as God,
Mm-hmm.
but if you're in Japan, you might think of it as something else.
Right, right. So broad field, you might have to narrow this to Christian theology or other kinds of theologies. It's a huge field. Anybody else? That's fine. We'll keep digging. I'll keep provoking the question. That's all right. But that's good. Even if we're to say things like, well, the Bible, right? We still have to get to the question of how. In other words, how does the Bible communicate? What kinds of truth does the Bible communicate? Tradition, right? How does tradition communicate? What kinds of ways does tradition communicate? Dissent, I mean, all sorts of ways in which we experience life, how we talk about God, how we might experience God in our own particular ways. To jump from, big intimidating question to now big intimidating person, John Calvin, with one on the Mount Rushmore. He's got the four windows in Westminster. I call it the Mount Rushmore window of Reformation theologians there. John Calvin is maligned in a number of ways, sometimes for good reason. I'm not sure I would want to have lived in Geneva during his time ruling the city, but he's got his most famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, this big 2-volume work that's really helpful if you have a door that won't stay open, but is something that a lot of us, I see Megan and Jeff in the back, had to read, at least parts of it, during seminary. This book opens, when I first read the opening lines of John Calvin's Institutes, I have to admit I was hooked. And this might surprise you by what he says. And the translation is a little archaic, so it doesn't roll off the tongue, but nevertheless, opening lines. Our wisdom, insofar as it ought to be deemed true and solid wisdom, consists almost entirely of two parts, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. But as these are connected together by many ties, it is not easy to determine which of the two precedes and gives birth to the other. In other words, knowledge of God and knowledge of self are in some ways inseparable. They're always tangled up together. And when we talk about God, we are sometimes talking about ourselves. When we talk about ourselves, we are also in some ways talking about God. And we might say that's something that you have to distinguish or untangle, but in many ways, Calvin acknowledges the way that those are intertwined, which I really like, because I tend to be a little bit inherently suspicious of people who can report God to me, right, as if they are an objective observer, if they have, snuck into God's file cabinet and seen all of the files or something like that. And so Calvin, I think here in some ways invites us to explore the ways in which our knowledge of God, our beliefs about God, are also entangled with who we are and how we live. In other words, theology, whatever it is, isn't just idle speculation about God by people with too much time on their hands in big libraries, right? There's something about it that's lived. I appreciate that because I appreciate the books that we're looking at today because they also connect to that way of understanding who God is. So hold that thought in your mind. Now we're going to go to a completely different medieval thinker or influencer, as the youngs like to say, and that is Michelangelo. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you might have seen this before, the creation of Adam, right? It's this magnificent kind of collection of biblical scenes. And here's this famous scene of God as a bearded old man bringing life to Adam. But my question is, who's that hanging out under God's left arm to blow it up for you, right? Who is this woman who's here next to God? Michelangelo didn't write for us a guide, didn't give us kind of a map of this. Art historians, biblical scholars, casual observers wonder, could this be Eve? Right? She is looking at Adam with a little side eye there, maybe aware of what's yet to come. Could this be Mary, the mother of Jesus, in some kind of pre-incarnate, appearance? Could it be an angel? All possibilities. But the leading candidate, and what I think is maybe the best candidate, is what if that is wisdom? What if that is, I'm getting, this is great. We're getting Pentecostal in here, getting some amens. What if this is wisdom? What if this is some kind of expression of God, partner of God? Who knows what Michelangelo is depicting here, but she certainly seems more prominent than any of these kind of cherubic, baby-faced, baby-fat angels, right, who are also there around God. And it looks like she knows something. I bring that up because we've got literature in the Bible that talks about wisdom as a figure, as a person who cooperates with God, who works with God, who is God. Maybe the best example of this comes from the book of Proverbs, one of the books we're going to be looking at here. And Proverbs, sometimes Proverbs are short proverbial sayings, advice for good living. Sometimes they are reflections on the nature of wisdom. And so here we have the voice of wisdom speaking in the book of Proverbs. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, at the beginning of God's work, the first of God's acts of long ago. So wisdom is in some ways the first creation, the first thing, the first expression of God. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. In other words, remember Genesis 1, all of that stuff. Before that, right? Here's the prequel to Genesis. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When God had not yet made earth and fields or the world's first bits of soil. When God established the heavens, I was there. When God drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he made firm the skies above, when God established the fountains of the deep, when God assigned to the sea its limit, you hear Genesis 1 in a sense being summarized, so that the waters might not transgress God's command. When God marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him like a master worker. And I was daily God's delight, playing before him always, playing in his inhabited world and delighting in the human race. A different image of God in Genesis 1, who speaks and things come into being. Here you've got this figure of wisdom who's a little bit more ingrained within creation, who's participating in the creative act, and who's also delighting in it and enjoying it. There's a book called The Wisdom of Solomon. This is not in Protestant Bibles. It's one of the books we'll look at this summer, perhaps. But it's there. Roman Catholics and some Orthodox groups see it as part of their Bibles. This is a Jewish writing, originally written in Greek, which is why Jews don't include it in their holy scriptures and why most Protestants don't. But it includes more kind of reflections on this female character of wisdom. And Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7 says this: "For wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. For she is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her. For she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of God's goodness." If you know John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Some of that might sound familiar. The book of Hebrews in the Newer Testament, chapter 1, the book of Colossians, chapter 2, in some ways imitates some of this language in talking about Jesus as a reflection of divinity. Although she is but one, she can do all things, and while remaining in herself, she renews all things. In every generation, she passes into holy souls and makes them friends of God and prophets. For God loves nothing so much as the person who lives with wisdom. Why all of the feminine pronouns here? Wisdom has typically been conceived in female terms. The noun in Hebrew, chokmah, which means wisdom, is a feminine noun. When that passes into Greek, the noun sophia, which means wisdom, also a feminine noun. In other words, wisdom is personified in the book of Proverbs as some kind of a force or an emanation of God, partnered with God in some way. present at creation, participating in creation. Wisdom appears to be in some ways separate from the stuff of creation itself. And like I said, appears to be this reflection of who God is. Wisdom is the way in which God animates the world with God's presence and with God's goodness. So we should know about this. We should know about this character and know about this this way of talking about wisdom. But I bring this up because it goes back to the question of what is theology and what are our sources of theology? How do we learn about theology? Because the books that we're studying today have to do with the question of divine wisdom. And so I want to just reflect on that just a little bit more, right? How do we construct theology, or how do we think about God, and how do we maybe encounter God based on how we experience everyday life? In other words, maybe theology isn't just what goes on in your mind and thinking and kind of an extension of philosophy. What if theology is more lived? What if theology involves more flesh and bones and sweat and blood and toil? That's what the authors of certain biblical books want us to think about. There's an idea here, right? There's an impulse. How do we encounter God in how we live? How do we encounter God in the knowledge or the practical wisdom that we gain? What if we can decenter theology? What if we can take theology away from temples and pulpits and scholars and the in-group, right? And talk about what do we learn about God in ordinary practice, right? In the stuff of life that's accessible to, indeed necessary for every single person, right? Our relationships, our families, our occupations, our professions, the chores that we have to do. What if all of these things are places where God can be encountered and known? We've looked at a bunch of different points of view in the Older Testament over the last however many months it's been since we started this in September. I know that's been really informative for us. A lot of us have talked about ways in which we see different theologies expressed in the Older Testament, which is great. But what we have here, when we're looking at some of these books that talk about wisdom, I think is something even really different. In other words, it's a different mode of talking about theology. Right? Remember the books of Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers. I skipped one. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. A tradition, foundational stories of a nation and about laws that we find in Torah. When we get to the prophets, right, Revelation, how do people attempt to speak for God and attempt to address the discrepancies they see between what reality is like and what the divine ideal is supposed to be? We looked at the Psalms during Lent and talked about the poetry of prayer and worship. But now, and this started with Job last week, if you were here or saw Margaret's presentation on Job, and also the books we're looking at today, we're moving into a different kind of mode. We're looking into the mode of reflection on life and embracing the struggles and the joys of being human. So the three books we're looking at today, right, in many ways are set apart from the grand saga that we've been tracing through the Older Testament. I'm not even going to put the timeline up today because we don't really know exactly where they came from. They appear to have come from a variety of times and were collected in a variety of places. They stand outside of that grand narrative, and so they're difficult to map, right? In some ways they belong to no time and they belong to all the times. That's maybe how wisdom works. So what are the three books? Have I lost anybody so far? I realize I'm kind of in the clouds right now still, but we're going to get down to practice, I promise. All right. The three books we're looking at today are all associated in some way with King Solomon. And Solomon is an interesting figure. Interesting, as we say in Minnesota. You thought David was bad, right? Solomon, yeah. Solomon had a rough time ruling, but the thing Solomon is perhaps best known for is his wisdom. When Solomon becomes king as a young man, he asks God for knowledge. It's actually knowledge and not wisdom that's used there. And we're told that because he asks for something so humble and so practical, God gives him a double share of his knowledge. And so part of the mythology around Solomon is that he was incredibly wise. And so we have three books here: the Song of Solomon, which in some traditions is called the Song of Songs. In some traditions, it's the Canticle of Canticles. take your pick. I'm going to call it the Song of Solomon. It's kind of traditional Protestant title. This is erotic love poetry. So it's good that Megan and Jeff have left, because this is where I might get a performance review after talking about this. But we're going to talk about erotic love poetry for a little bit. We're going to talk about the book of Proverbs as well. Practical, oh, Vince is here. I'm in huge trouble. Proverbs is advice for living, right? Very practical advice. We'll see more of that. And then the book of Ecclesiastes, also known as Kohelet, more on that in just a second, in some ways is often seen as a more cynical take on things. Kind of a, what's the purpose of life anyway? Right? Does any of this stuff work? Is any of this any good? If you were here last week, you remember Job is in some ways maybe a criticism of the neat and tidiness of wisdom. Job saying, like, all your good advice is really not helpful when I'm experiencing suffering. Right? All of the rules, so to speak, that we thought were true about God don't hold up in the face of my unspeakable suffering. People dispute whether or not to call Song of Solomon wisdom. I'll talk more about that later. But Song of Solomon, erotic poetry about young lovers. Proverbs, kind of teaching, especially for young men, kind of in the court, like how do you grow up and make good choices in your life? While, again, Ecclesiastes, a little bit more cynical in some ways. There are some rabbis who proposed that perhaps Song of Solomon was written by Solomon when he was a young man. Perhaps Proverbs was written when he was middle-aged and being really diligent. And maybe Ecclesiastes is at the end of his life where he's just like, to hell with it all, like whatever. The rabbis can always be counted on for stuff like that. Ecclesiastes, also called Kohelet. Kohelet is its Hebrew name. Your Jewish friends and neighbors refer to the book as Kohelet. Ecclesiastes is just the Greek translation of that Hebrew word. You might think that sounds like the word for church, ecclesia, things like that. An ecclesia is simply an assembly. So Ecclesiastes means the one called out of an assembly. And Kohelet is like the Hebrew word kahal, which also means assembly. So I'm not exactly sure how best to translate it, but it has this idea of a teacher, right? Somebody who rises up in an assembly and speaks or gives guidance. So that's just in terms of the title. And I'm going to talk more about the mode of these books. Like, what are they trying to do? And I'm going to talk about the content of these books, because all three are very difficult to map. But first, Song of Solomon. Like I said, scholars debate about whether or not we should categorize this book as wisdom. The word wisdom never appears in the book. God is never explicitly mentioned in this book. It's, like I said, it's erotic poetry, but it appears to have been read pretty widely. We do have mention in some Jewish texts of debates about whether or not it's really a holy book, whether or not it's really appropriate, whether it belongs in the banquet hall as opposed to in the synagogue. Those are the kinds of questions. But fragments of this book were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls, if you don't, come back this summer. These are not people who really talked about having a good time in life, right? These are in a very austere sect of people. I've been told that Latter-day Saints don't consider Song of Solomon to be inspired like the rest of the Bible is. I haven't been able to confirm that. But it's a story about young lovers, about ordinary folk, and it's very sensual, right? It appeals to all of the senses. It appeals to longing and to desire. So I had to think really long and hard about what texts I could or should show on the screen and what artwork I should show. A lot of the artwork that tries to depict scenes from Song of Solomon don't entail a lot of clothing. But at the same time, we've got the Granlund sculpture on Nicollet Mall. We've got Granlund, in the gallery, so I'm going to risk it. But here's just kind of I was going to say a taste. I don't want to use a sensual word. Here's an example of what we find. How fair and pleasant you are, O loved one, delectable maiden. You are stately as a palm tree, and your breasts are like its clusters. I said, I will climb the palm tree and lay hold of its branches. Many decades ago, I did youth ministry, and every now and then students would be like, I heard Song of Solomon is erotic, like poetry about sex. Is that right? I'd be like, yeah, that's right. And then they're like, I'm going to read it. And then like a week later, they'd be like, I read it, and it's really not that sexy. I said, well, it's metaphor. The metaphors are different than maybe what you're used to seeing. And they're like, yeah, I guess so. But anyway, so one piece of art this is by a feminist author, which I think is tame enough and kind of funny enough to show as well as... somebody embracing a palm tree and being embraced back by the palm tree as well. Which is funny, but it's also one of the things that's striking about the book is that both the male and the female lover in the book speak. They both express desire. There's a sense of mutuality about their love, about their courtship, and about their longing, which you don't see much of that. I mean, you don't see much in the Bible that's a kind of celebration of human sexuality in general. But to have one like this that's, recognizes that relationships actually involve two people from two different perspectives is remarkable. More on that in just a minute. Another part of Song of Solomon that I really appreciate, and this is actually a clock tower where I went to college. That's some wealthy donor had said, "I'm going to build a clock tower in your college to honor the memory of my deceased wife," and inscribed on it a quote from Song of Solomon, which is, "Love is as strong as death." And I used to look at that and just think I like that. I like that line. So it's not all, as racy as other parts, but set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is strong as death, passion fierce as the grave. Love's flashes are flashes of fire, a raging flame. Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it. If one offered for love all the wealth of one's house, it would be utterly scorned, right? You can't buy it with all of this wealth. For a long time, the Song of Solomon has been, and these people have argued that the book is an allegory. This is about, and this is true for Jewish rabbis as well as for Christian theologians. Jewish rabbis have said this is a book about God's love for the world, about God's passionate love for Israel. Christian scholars have said this is a book about God's love for the church, God's passionate love for the church. Mark is not convinced here in the front. One ancient rabbi, Akiva, says the book is so holy. He says it's the holiest of all the books, and that's why you shouldn't read it in the banquet hall. In other words, by making it allegorical, you take all of the celebration of human love out of it, potentially, right? Well, some people are saying, no, the book belongs in the banquet hall. It's not scripture. And Akiva's like, oh, it's so holy that's why we're going to keep it here and not let it go to the banquet hall. But I think it's a book that is, again, quite remarkably just celebrating what love looks like, right? And so there's been various takes on the book. Is it a helpful book? How do we interpret it? Feminist scholars have come down in a variety of places about the book. Some have talked about how egalitarian the relationship appears to be in the book. And, in it you've got women who speak about desire as well as men speaking about desire. Others on a different side will say, well, at the same time, the female characters appear to be the creations of male authors, right? In some ways, what we're seeing here is a reflection of male fantasies or desires about women as well, and wouldn't it be nice if the book seemed to have been written by women? I don't want to necessarily divide that debate today, just let you know that the book is debated, but I want to share some helpful sentences here from one scholar writing on the Song of Solomon, Carrie Ellen Walsh, who has this to say, and I think this is a good approach into the book. She says, "The Song of Solomon is a celebration of all things of human life. The book is, in essence, a spiritual book concerned with the responses of the soul to life and its pleasures. As such, it is neither secular nor religious, since these are modern categories and carriers of dualism. Reading the book yields a renewed sense of the erotic as a human energy, a life-enhancing response to the world. Finally, discerning the spiritual dimension of the song is potentially the most rewarding part of the investigation. For if there can be a unity of the spiritual and sexual impulses, then we have come a long way toward healing the rift between religion and sex, between the spirit and the body, and we catch biblical testimony to the sheer glee of being human." She says, "The song's unremitting, unabashed attention to desire provides a needed heuristic salve, right? A cure for those who have been emotionally splintered by religion." I take that as a challenge, right? Can we read the book in that way? But I have to move on to Proverbs. Proverbs describes wisdom as somebody selling their wares, right? Somebody trying to entice you, somebody on the street corner saying, buy from me, buy from me. Wisdom cries out in the street, right? It's like you're in a marketplace. Who am I going to buy from today? Who's got the best stuff to sell? In the squares, wisdom, raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? For waywardness kills the simple, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But those who listen to me will be secure and will live at ease without dread of disaster. So it's like a sales pitch for wisdom in this book, right? How much will you love being foolish? Don't you know what you're missing if you would only come into this shop, into this store? And we see as well in Proverbs then a lot of kind of more like aphoristic, like little aphorisms, aphoristic bits of wisdom, the kinds of things you would pass down, the kind of things you would see on like the bottom of a cap of Snapple, right? Or I'm addicted to Dove Squares. You open Dove Squares, there's a little quote, something like that. And so you see things like this, right? Go to the ant, you lazy bones, consider its ways and be wise. Without having any chief or officer or ruler, the ant, prepares its food in summer and gathers its sustenance in harvest. This is me in high school. My mom came in. My alarm was still going off. How long will you lie there, O lazy bones? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed warrior. So it's beautifully poetic, but it's also deeply practical. Right? This is the kinds of things you teach young people. Some of us who still haven't learned. Right? Choose the good, shun the bad, right? Look at even how nature can teach you. Even the ant can teach you in terms of how it works, what it does. So again, it's that kind of a book with all of this deeply practical advice. One of my favorites from Proverbs 17, better to meet a she-bear robbed of her cubs than to confront a fool immersed in folly. Good advice during the current political season, perhaps, right? And Brennan Breed talks about this in the video. He says in Proverbs, people who embrace folly aren't stupid people, but they're people who have chosen against wisdom. In other words, this isn't about the smart versus the dumb, right? This is about what kind of life are you choosing? What kind of values are you embracing? And so that's one of the reasons about don't debate them. Don't even get into it because you've got these two different sides. The book of Proverbs is very much kind of a two-ways mentality. Maybe remember Psalm chapter 1, right, about the righteous versus the wicked. That two-ways rhetoric is really effective rhetoric if you're trying to urge people to certain kinds of behavior, if you're trying to instill a sense of urgency. It's difficult to live by, right? We know that the world isn't divided into neat camps of saints and sinners, right, or good versus evil. Most of us live in the gray. But Proverbs has this sense of wisdom versus folly. Which one do you want? Which one are you attracted to? Proverbs as well has this remarkable section, basically parts of chapter 22, all of 23, and parts of chapter 24, that appear to be an adaptation of an Egyptian work. And I put it on the board here because I can never pronounce it right. It's the instruction of Amenemope. I always want to say like LMNOP, like the letters, but it's very close to that, but not quite. The instruction of Amenemope, which is an Egyptian work that was finally translated and published in the early 20th century. And scholars, Egyptologists date it to around 1100 BCE, but it's 30 sayings from a kind of a royal figure, kind of an official, so you have to look at it, Amenemope, to his youngest son about how to live. And it's not quite copied in the book of Proverbs, but Proverbs appears to be an adaptation of this Egyptian work. And Brennan Breed talks about this, which is remarkable, right? That part of what Proverbs is a collection. It seems to be a collection of wisdom gathered from different people, maybe different tribes in Israel, different times and places, and even surrounding nations. So we know that other ancient nations had similar types of literature. Some of this was reserved for, mostly the sons of elites, right? How do you provide moral instruction to young men so they might grow up and become good court officials? But some of the instruction also appears to be folk wisdom, right? As well as kind of, how do you train an elite person, elite member of society? So just to note that there is a kind of an openness to the book of Proverbs, along with the way in which the dualism might seem to be narrowing the lanes for us. So here's a comparison of some of the dualism. Think about what do you see or hear. Again, here's a reflection on wisdom as a female character. Wisdom has built her house. She has hewn her 7 pillars. She has slaughtered her animals. She has mixed her wine. She has also set her table, right? She's preparing a feast. She has sent out her female servants. She calls from the highest places in town, "You who are simple, turn in here." To those without sense, she says, "Come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Lay aside immaturity and live and walk in the way of insight." You see how it's trying to make this alluring and attractive. The counterpart to what scholars have called Lady Wisdom is Lady Folly. And Brennan Breed spends some time in the video. It's really helpful talking about the ways in which this is obviously unhelpful, right? To have kind of only 2 visions of being female, right? Either to be this icon of wisdom or this absolute kind of, what's the word I wanted? Kind of abomination of folly, kind of a thing. But here's the opposite, right? The foolish woman is loud. She is ignorant and knows nothing. You can probably tell that men wrote this. She sits at the door of her house on a seat at the high places of the town, calling to those who pass by, who are going straight in their way. "You who are simple, turn in here." And to those without sense, she says, "Stolen water is sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant." In other words, don't share, right? Why set a banquet to benefit others? But they do not know that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol, the underworld, the place of the dead in Hebrew reckoning. So notice some of the back and forth here, right? Notice the kind of the parallels, but also this binary that we encounter in the book of Proverbs. I'm going to move on to Ecclesiastes. Sorry, it's quick. Oh, Ecclesiastes. This is how it opens. "Vanity of vanities," says the teacher. "Vanity of vanities," says Kohelet. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." And by vanity, he doesn't mean selfishness. It's just illusoriness, right? Impermanence, temporality. The term there translated vanity is the Hebrew word hevel, and it means simply like a mist or a vapor, right? It's just like a puff of smoke, right? It's there for a minute, and then it's gone. Ecclesiastes is what happens when you grow up and you have children and you teach them the book of Proverbs and you get them to follow all the rules and you work really hard and you save all your money for college and your child goes to college and takes philosophy classes and comes home and suddenly has rejected all of your values. And you're like, I was a philosophy major. Right? What I mean is, right, there's a way in which Ecclesiastes is just asking the question, is it really all worth it? Like, what's the point of everything? Which is also wisdom, which is also a function of wisdom. And Brennan Breed talks a bit about this verse. I'll leave the video for more about that. The most famous section of Ecclesiastes is probably this one from chapter 3. "For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pick up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing." You get the point. You've probably heard the song. It has kind of this like life is what it is sense about it. And this is sometimes taken to be cynical, right? Just kind of like, what control do I have, right? Things are going to happen. Life's going to happen. And Brennan Breed, again, in the video, has some helpful reflection on this, where he says, keep reading, right, after that poetry is done, where the author says, "What gain have the workers from their toil? I have seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busyness. In other words, I've lived life. I've seen the way in which people work. I've seen the ways in which life is often struggle. God has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, God has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. In other words, God has given us this sense of temporality, right? We're aware of the passing of time. We're aware of our past. We're aware there is still a future, but we can't fully know the past. We can't fully know the future. All we can really embrace is the current moment, which isn't necessarily despair or cynicism. I know, the author says, that there is nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. In other words, it's a book that tries to say maybe the struggle is what life's about, right? Maybe it's not finding the answers. Maybe it's embracing the struggle of life. There might be some similar things in the book of Job as well from last week. We're not going to know all the answers, right? God hasn't set up the world where we can know all of the answers. But maybe the struggle, maybe the strife, maybe the adventure is where the joy lies. And maybe that's the challenge, the theological challenge is, where do you find your happiness in God without demanding a life free from pain, or a life of perfection, or a life full of abundance? That might be what Ecclesiastes is trying to say a well-lived life could look like. Starting to wrap up, right? So where do these books come from? Like I said, there's been questions about should they be like in the Bible or not. That's really only about the Song of Solomon, which has, maybe for obvious reasons, sometimes made religious people a little squeamish. But Israel's neighbors appear to have played a part in these books. Again, we have other examples of love poetry from the ancient world, other examples of proverbial sayings from the ancient world, other ancient texts that are deeply concerned with the moral formation of young people, but also, and don't miss this, right, these theological convictions that are here, right, that God can be known through the everyday stuff of life, by how you work, by how you spend your time, by how you embrace the present, right? In other words, theology isn't just about knowing the answers, right? It's about how or what a well-lived life might look like, and how can you embrace the goodness of God amidst the turmoil of life, amidst the struggle of life, amidst all of the people of folly that you don't want to get stuck into arguments with. But how do you discover that in the everydayness? What I love about this is it's a reminder that everybody's a theologian, and every moment of life is potentially a moment for thinking theologically, right? For discovering the question of where is God among us? And so it goes back to that original question that I posed that, made you laugh and maybe groan about what is theology, right? Where and how do we learn about God? I think in the books, in Ecclesiastes, in Song of Solomon, and Proverbs, there are conversations that are taking place, sometimes between two lovers, sometimes between, wisdom and humanity, sometimes between Kohelet and everybody else, and in the book of Job, certainly between Job and God. There's at least three different dynamics that are going on. On the one hand, we see people learning from teachers. Somebody's passing down wisdom. More experienced people are teaching less experienced. Don't make the mistakes I made, or this has always worked for me, right? This is what tradition has said. And there's ways in which, of course, tradition is part of how we learn about God. There's also in these books people who are living and interacting with the world. And I put in parentheses, also interacting with people from other cultures as well. MNP, LMNOP, right? The Egyptian book there. Other ancient cultures whose knowledge, whose wisdom is being assimilated into these books. In other words, it's not just about adhering to tradition. These books also commend experiences, right? Living our lives, openness to others and to new experiences, and to dialogue. And then the third way, I think the books also acknowledge that we encounter the limits of what we can know about God and about life. We discover that some things are unknowable, right? Some knowledge is reserved for God. Some things are either above our pay grade or maybe just don't make sense. We want them to make sense. And so maybe part of how we learn about God as well is through grateful acceptance of our limitation and of mystery. so often Christian religion gets framed as, here are all the answers, right? Here's the sermon series, right? 10 ways to raise a healthy family, right? 5 ways to achieve happiness. And maybe our knowledge about God, maybe our growth in God is also about developing a deeper capacity to admit what we don't know and to embrace mystery as well. Anyway, that's wisdom literature in a nutshell. Are there questions or comments? Now, if not, I've got some questions for us to ponder. Beth, could you run the microphone perhaps to my left, your right? Yeah, got 1, 2 on here. One.
Could I
Excuse me. Okay.
Matt, I'm kind of flashing on something you taught us a couple years ago in the Owning Our Theology series that you did. And one thing we learned about is sources of truth and knowledge in the Christian tradition. And I came out as scripture, tradition, reason, and experience as kind of the full set. It strikes me that what you're talking about here fits pretty well into that. You've got the tradition, you've got the experience. This is all within Scripture, interesting. But the third one there is sort of like reason but not reason at the same time. It's like pursuing human knowledge but then being humble and realizing there are limits to what you can gain from it. So would you want to comment on how those mesh together?
Yeah, that's a good point. So and so what you named, the Wesleyans have a name for it. The Wesleyans call it the quadrilateral, right? We encounter God through Scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, which you don't have to be Methodist to like that. I like that. I think it's a great way of reminding ourselves that it's not, the Bible doesn't just come to us and like fill us with knowledge or something. We negotiate all of these things. But there are some connections here, I think. If we didn't have these books, then the Older Testament is largely a story of kings and prophets and rulers and leaders. And it'd be nice if we knew more about kind of the voices behind some of these sayings. But there is a kind of practicality about it. There's a kind of like a populism about it, right? That you can know about God if your day is about nothing but raising kids and fighting a system that's geared against you, that makes everything difficult, right? That in those daily tasks, God is knowable, God is ascertainable. But there's also this at the same time, right? Don't trust those people who tell you can know everything. And so, I would add to that reason, there's a kind of humility of knowledge, right? That maybe spiritual maturity, as these books help us imagine, especially Ecclesiastes, especially Job, is a kind of acknowledgement of our limits. I don't know if that helps. We could put that under reason for sure. Sometimes I think in our culture, reason is kind of this trajectory with no horizon, right? Give us enough time and enough resources, and eventually we're going to figure everything out. We're going to science everything to the point where we can know everything. Maybe that's true. It's not going to happen in my lifetime. Thanks for the question. And then after this, I will give you questions to either think about it at your tables or on your way home.
Well, thank you. I think I've been confusing theology and dogma.
Oh, yeah. Easily done.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say dogma is, here's what we believe. I would add to that, I think there's theology, there's confession, there's dogma. I mean, dogma has a sense of settled. This is what we all know is right, don't we? Confession, we read a confession at baptisms, right? We belong to God who is creating, I'm going to get myself in trouble if I try to recite it from memory. That is kind of, that confession, I think, is together corporately, we think this is where we are. This is where we've agreed to dispute these things or to discuss these things or to glory in these things. And theology, I think, is a lot more, it's simply, how do you talk about God? How do you encounter God? And that's shared. It's also deeply personal, right? It has to be shared. Otherwise, there's nothing more scary than somebody who sits alone and figures out theology and then wants to make everybody else adhere to it. Well, there are more dangerous things. That's a dangerous thing. But as well, a community that never lets an individual pop up and say, I disagree, right, is also perhaps using theology in ways that are violent. Yeah. We need one more in the back with Bill. So there's never a direct line from table to table in this room.
Yeah, Matt, I was taken with that quote from Proverbs where it said, wisdom has built her house and she has hewn her 7 pillars. And I was wondering, do the 7 pillars actually refer to something that we're aware of?
This is easy for me to answer. I don't know. Yeah, I can't even pretend. I'm sure somebody's proposed something. I'd have to look it up. Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I tell my students at the seminary, I'm like, numbers in the Bible don't mean anything. At the same time, of course, they mean everything to a lot of people. So, I mean, like, they do mean something, but yeah. But I don't think what I mean by that is they open themselves up to multiple meanings. But yeah, I don't know exactly with regard to that image. If I'd gone slower or faster, questions to discuss or ponder. And we have a little bit of time, but maybe just think about these, put them in your mind or snap a photo of the screen. What attracts you about this focus on divine wisdom? Or do you think there are limitations? This is the other side. What attracts you? And do you think there are limitations to thinking about God and faith in this way, right? This focus on the kind of the practicality of encountering God in the stuff of our lives. And the second one is, as you think about how we talk about God and faith in our common life here at Westminster, and I use that we really openly, where specifically do you see us giving attention to each of these ways of learning and growing? Like, how does tradition function here? Right? How is tradition part of the ways in which we socialize people into this community and invite people into this community? How is this a community that also embraces people's diverse experiences? How are we open to new questions and new perspectives? And where are we engaged in dialogue, right, within our community, but also outside the community with other communities? And then where do we acknowledge a grateful acceptance of limitation and mystery? I think some communities do maybe one of these 3 better than others, or 2 of these 3 better than others. How do you keep them all in balance? It's just an interesting question. Maybe how do you encounter that in your own spirituality, in the things that happen here at Westminster, the things that are said here at Westminster, and how those might draw you in, how those might feed your own soul as well. So think about those. One quick announcement. Next Sunday is Jonah, which is only a 4-chapter book, which means we can breathe a little slower. No need to jump through 3 books. And we'll look at Jonah the Reluctant Prophet next week. So I saw a hand in my peripheral vision. Betty. My clock says we've got 3 minutes at least. And then I have to go preach a sermon. So I'm going to run out of here in 3 minutes and leave you all to criticize or figure it all out.
I just wanted to comment on that first question.
This one.
Because what I interpreted this in hearing about wisdom, seeing the picture there, God likes wisdom more than Adam. First of all, He'll touch Adam, but He loves wisdom, and I thought of it as yin and yang. That wisdom came with God. That wisdom it wasn't created by God. And it is the male female. It is the whole concept of God, that the word God has been problematic for many because it's so male in its formation. But that ultimate reality, that great mystery, which we call God, is is neither male nor female.
Yeah.
So that's my interpretation.
Yeah, I totally agree. And you're right to I think if I hear you right, Betty, to say that like it's hard to tell what wisdom is. It's not a created thing, but it's also not the same thing as God. And so that emanation is a word that got used in one of those texts, which I like, what just kind of naturally flows out of God, and then right, our gendered language can't do justice to either, but at least we have a kind of a balance that's obviously been not weighted evenly throughout the tradition, which I like. And part of it, people speculate about this. Did this originally come to the idea that God had a divine consort? Like a lot of gods have male-female partners in the ancient world, but in Jewish monotheism, that's pretty much ruled out. Right? There's got to be one God, and so how does that one God also display a capacity for relationship that's not just a master-servant relationship? And wisdom and the feminization of wisdom along with the masculinization of God might be a way of trying to express that complexity of the identity of God. That's about as far as I'm willing to look into the mind of God this morning, but yeah. But I think the gendered aspect of it is incredibly powerful, like you said, for people who have found religion and the notion of God too much like the bearded old guy in Michelangelo's painting. So thank you. I look forward to next week with Jonah and